Gonville and Caius College, Cambridge, late autumn 2019. 40 years after it welcomed women through its doors, we're meeting Cian's past and present to talk about some of the most important issues facing women today.
I've always wondered why the econ library, we don't have a really nice econ library.
It depends on what your views are on architecture. My husband really loves that building, the Austin Robinson building in the Marshall Library.
It's the worst building.
They stand out architecturally, don't they?
20 years separates Samantha Onyekwere and Victoria Bateman's time at the college, both studying economics.
So when I arrived in 2017, things were not so different from how they are now. We were still in the Brexit debacle. We just had the general election over the summer. Theresa May had lost her majority, so no one really knew what was going to happen.
That's interesting, because when I came here as an undergraduate, so 20 years ago or so now, things were looking more optimistic, at least on the face of it. So unemployment had come down, inflation had come down. There was a new Labour government that had just come to power in 1997. There were big changes on the economic policy front. This is the Fellows part of the library, which is always really quiet, and you've got some really historic books in here, including some I imagine that are worth quite a lot of money to antiquarian book collectors.
I've only been in here once. Matriculation.
It is where we do matriculation ceremonies, you're right, and it's where we have all the big Fellows meetings as well. Debate the big issues of the day.
It's so pretty. I forgot what it's actually like. I will not lie, I do not go to the library very frequently. I sometimes go to get a nice picture for my Instagram story.
After their visit to the college library, they sat down together to find out more about each other and their interests in economics. Victoria started with a few questions for Samantha about her take on the current economic and political climate.
Are you feeling quite pessimistic in general? Do you think there is this pessimism that's gripping us in Britain and in the wider world?
Well, definitely. As in, for instance, like you've spoken before about when you were a student, how things were there. Contrast to the economy that I've been brought up in. Like, the financial crisis is one of my earlier memories. Yeah. And since then, I guess you've just been growing up in like a very anemic economy.
Yes.
We don't really have any experience of the good times in the economy, yeah. I guess. So I hope one day I will. But yes, I think for people my age, like, the economy has shaped their worldview in some ways and not positively.
That's interesting, because when I came here as an undergraduate, so 20 years ago or so now, things were looking more optimistic, at least on the face of it. So unemployment had come down from the highs that it was in the 80s and early 90s. Inflation had come down. There was a new Labour government that had just come to power in 1997, promising new investment in public services. There were big changes on the economic policy front. So with regard to monetary policy, the Bank of England had just been made independent. And so the idea was that would insulate it from political pressure. In terms of fiscal policy, Gordon Brown brought his prudence and his fiscal rules, but that made some way for public investment. So I think there was a degree of optimism for the future, and you're right that actually since then the optimism does seem to have turned to pessimism. We are in quite different economic times, but I think at the same time you can see some of the seeds of where we are right now back then. So whilst on the face of it in the late 90s things were improving, underneath that you still had the regional inequality. For example, you had an economy that was becoming increasingly based on consumer spending and the consumer debt that comes with that didn't provide stable foundations for the future.
Most people have grown up in homes that their parents have owned, but don't think it's ever going to be likely that they're going to own their own home. Also with Brexit, I think most young people have like a more global worldview, have always been as part of the European Union. Like, when I was born, we were in the European Union, so it's kind of like, for us, it's a very weird experience to like be forced into this more insular setting. And I think it goes against probably most values that most young people have. And I don't know what the world's going to look like in the future, which...
And that's why perhaps you're thinking of going into politics, do you think?
Yes, I definitely. For instance, just looking at the recent political happenings, so if we look at the 2017 general election, and then the country has become more polarised than ever along generational lines, which is quite different to what we've seen in the past, where it's been more like class-based as such. So I think as younger people start going into the workforce, we're going to start seeing some big changes in the political sphere specifically, as we become like a more, a larger proportion of the electorate.
So there's some hope.
Yeah, but I can't say I'm not too optimistic. Like, I don't know, as in, I think it's hard to be optimistic.
I grew up in a working class family in Oldham. My dad left school at 15 and my mum at 16, so I was the first to go to university. I had a state school education right through. Education was very much something that my father saw as the way that I could escape the difficult circumstances that I sometimes had as a child, to have perhaps a more comfortable life. It requires quite a long-term approach because, of course, when you're a young person and you're in quite difficult circumstances, the easy thing to do is actually to try and fit in, which sometimes means not doing well at school and, sex, drugs, rock and roll type thing. But I tried to keep my eye on the ball, focus on the long term, so did work hard. Got good GCSEs, and that was really a push then to stay on and do A-levels. There was a question as to whether my family could afford for me to stay on and do A-levels, so that was a bit of a shaky time, but actually we managed it, and I did do A-levels and applied to Cambridge. And when I applied to Cambridge, it was one of those things that people kind of laughed at me for doing, the kind of thing that seemed unachievable. I'd grown up, in a sense, being laughed at, and I always had the view that you don't let what other people think stand in your way, and you don't have to conform. You have to be guided by your own conscience, by your own dreams. I think the difficulty is that there was a sense in which I never felt I quite fitted in where I grew up, and then I got to Cambridge, and for a while I didn't feel I fitted in here either. So, the beautiful buildings, the traditions, the history and so on, just not something that I grew up with. But what you learn to do is see beyond that and see, it's not like Cambridge can just knock down all of those buildings and forget all of those traditions, that those things are actually really just superficial. And what matters is the people. Coming to Cambridge literally changed my life. But I came to Cambridge with a view that I wanted to understand the economy so that I could try and make sure that other people didn't have to have the same bad experiences that I had growing up. So with a view that trying to better understand prosperity, poverty and inequality and so on, that we can make sure everybody has opportunities in life. So what are your experiences of Cambridge, Samantha? Was it a bit of a culture shock for you as well?
I actually feel like when I came, I felt quite comfortable very quickly. Everyone that I met straight away was really friendly. I loved everyone that I lived with and everyone on our course. We have a good year group, right? Yeah, I remember being worried beforehand because you hear, oh, Cambridge, it's going to be everyone's going to be really posh and...
There are lots of myths, aren't there, about Cambridge?
Yeah. And I was thinking, oh, am I going to fit in? But because I always wanted to go somewhere really meaningful. Lots of universities across the country are all quite similar, and I wanted to go somewhere that would have the best opportunities, where you'd meet the most interesting people. I always knew I'd want to go to either Cambridge or an Ivy League university, something like that.
It's quite interdisciplinary, isn't it? Because of the college system, actually, every day you're meeting people from different subjects, so you get that dynamic exchange of ideas and so on, whereas I think in a lot of places you're very much surrounded by people in your own subject, and it can become quite insular.
Yeah, I agree 100%. The college system it creates a community that you don't get elsewhere. Without the college system, then we wouldn't be able to make those ties as easily. Economics is usually not something that people study until A-level. So I think with me, probably with most people, you don't really know what economics is until you study it. So it's kind of just something that you add on, like, oh, that looks interesting. And then as you learn more about it, it becomes your favourite.
You're right, actually, that what is economics? People in a sense understand the economy, and of course we're all living and breathing the economy every day, and every single decision we make, no matter how intimate, feeds in to affect that economy. How many children we have, whether we work part-time or long-term, whether we go to university or not, all of these decisions affect the economy, and yet the economy seems something mythical and somehow separate, something that is going on in the world of high finance or in stock markets.
Because I do remember why I chose it. It was because I'd done like a citizenship studies course during secondary school. And there was like a part of the course that we learned about the financial crisis. And I was like, oh, okay, this is economics and that's interesting. I just felt like it brought many subjects into it, which is something that I've always liked compared to something like physics or something like that, where you really are in like a vacuum of a sense. Like, if you're doing maths, it doesn't really matter what's going on in the rest of the world.
Yeah.
Whereas,
it's a magpie subject, isn't it, economics? It does bring together society, so sociology, a bit of anthropology, ethnography as well, philosophy. You've got the question of the individual versus society and potential conflicts or complementarities between them, politics, history, a bit of maths as well in terms of whether we can work out general economic laws to try and understand the world around us. I guess it makes it seem difficult, but also all the more exciting to be able to join the dots between so many different aspects of life, so many different subjects, do you think?
For me personally, as I've gone through the degree, I've become more interested in the more greater context of economics and the political aspects of what's going on outside of just the models that we're creating and learning in like macro or something.
Do you find that those models that you're learning in economic theory, do you find that they fit well with the world around you, or that there is a mismatch between economic theory and the reality of the world out there?
For the most case, I would say that they don't match very well, at least up to the level that we've learned. As in, you'll have like two models to look at the same issue, and then you can change assumptions and then you get completely opposite results. So then I guess it's trying to decide when you want to make it in the real world, like where the real world actually lies between
those two extreme sets of assumptions.
So, yeah. Obviously for me, it was you who I first met and who first taught me and was my director of studies throughout the degree. And who was the influence for you?
I was taught by Ian Macpherson, who was by then a very well-retired economic historian, but still teaching. And he had this amazingly historic room in the Old Court, straddling two of the beautiful courtyards with windows looking out in each direction. So he seemed to be kind of up on a pedestal looking over life in college. And he was a Scot. I came from the north, so there was a bit of similarity there. Before I came here, I spent my summer reading a lot of history of economic thought. And actually, I thought when I came to Cambridge that an economics degree would involve reading Smith and Marx and Ricardo and so on. And actually, no, it doesn't. It involves reading textbooks with mathematical, sometimes quite dry, models of the economy. So actually, I used my essays with Dr Macpherson, which involved thinking about the history of the economy. I used them as an opportunity to bring in some of that history of economic thought. And he would, in every supervision, whatever we were talking about, he would turn to me and he would say, "So, Victoria, what would Karl Marx think of this question?" So I think he tried to develop my interests in some of those big economic questions that economists have been thinking about for centuries, but in a sense can can be lost. The funny thing is, when I went to Oxford to do economic history, my supervisor there said to me quite honestly, Victoria, you will never be taken seriously as an economic historian unless you do more economics. So after doing my master's in economic history, I then switched to the economics faculty in Oxford, where I did master's papers in economics. Before then, I did a PhD, a DPhil, in the economics faculty there on an economic history subject, the same subject I would do in a history department, but the feeling was because it was rubber-stamped economics that somehow made me more valuable, which I think says a lot about how economists see themselves as the king of the social scientists, which I think is a very bad, very unfortunate situation to be in, but it was the strategic game in a sense that I was asked to play. So when I was first here as an undergraduate, women were really few and far between. I don't know, in terms of your experiences, Samantha, today, 20 years on, do you feel, as a woman, do you feel that you stand out in economics? Or do you feel that there's much greater gender equality in the subject than perhaps there was in my day?
It's still obviously majority men by far, but I don't feel like I stand out as a woman. There's a lot of us, especially in Keys, and it can vary a lot between colleges, which I don't really know why, because there are some colleges that have like 12 economists a year and they're always all guys. I'm like, that's kind of odd.
You see, that I'm Director of Studies, we have 50-50. Yeah.
I always felt from the beginning, like, if that's a path that I want to go down as an academic in economics, and that's... that would be an opportunity for me. Yeah. I remember someone even commenting, because my further maths class was majority girls.
Oh, that's very unusual.
Not in line with the national trend.
So if we think about the wider world, who has most inspired you? Who do you see as your mentor?
My personal role model, I'd have to choose Christine Lagarde. Because there's like so many things that I want to do, and like, part of my life has been like agonizing over what career can I choose, and she's just done everything, and there's nothing that she hasn't done that isn't impressive.
So tell us what she's done. She's quite an impressive woman, isn't she?
Yeah, so she started off as a partner in a law firm, Baker McKenzie, and well, she didn't start off as a partner, but she became a partner, and she became head of Baker McKenzie in Europe, I think, and then she became a minister in the French government. Then she became the finance minister, so the Chancellor of the Exchequer equivalent. And then she became head of the IMF. And now she's the president of the ECB. And that mirrors a lot of the things that I want to do in my life. Well, not necessarily a law firm, but going into the corporate world, going into politics, and being an IGO, and then central bank. That's just like, people often think, oh, which way am I going to go? Am I going to sell my soul, or am I going to like go work for an IGO or development bank or something like that? And I just think like seeing her just makes you realise like you can
do both.
You can do everything if you want. What about you?
So it's probably going to be really controversial what I'm going to say, but I was born in 1979, the year Margaret Thatcher came to power. Now, Margaret Thatcher was a very divisive figure in the community where I grew up. In Oldham, deindustrialisation, some saw that as a product of Thatcher's policies. Other people saw Thatcher as selling opportunities, and actually my dad, who'd had a difficult time in the boom and bust of the 80s and early 90s, was, I think, in some ways inspired by Thatcher actually to start up his own business. I mean, actually it didn't go very well as the economy dived, but nevertheless I think some saw her as an inspiration in terms of, times were difficult, and she gave them the feeling that no matter where you came from, that you could achieve anything, that you could start your own business, that you could progress your life. And for some people that worked out, but for a lot of people it didn't. And, my dad's business, and this was at a time when I was growing up as a child, had a really, really difficult time in the deep recession in the early 1990s. He was in the construction industry, and so what happened was the bigger businesses in construction couldn't pay the smaller businesses like my dad's, and so that created a lot of debt. And I saw the way in which a small business person like him would be between the big giant businesses who couldn't afford to pay, but then also the people that he was employing that he couldn't afford to pay their wages as a result. And there were times when people would turn up at our door with baseball bats, and, you know, it was really quite extreme. So Thatcher was a very divisive figure, but at the same time, I do think growing up as a girl and her being in the most powerful position in this country, our first female prime minister, did make me feel that you can achieve anything. And interestingly, of course, she was from a working class background. Her parents were greengrocers, and she went from there to study at Oxford. So I think there were some similarities in terms of our backgrounds as well. So whilst I don't necessarily agree with her politics or her policy through and through, it did make me feel that as a woman that you could aspire and achieve. So that's my controversial choice. But actually, once I got to Cambridge, I soon found out about this shadowy figure that hangs over the Cambridge economics faculty, a very, very big female figure, Joan Robinson. So she was one of the very few female economists here in Cambridge in the early to mid 20th century, and she was around at the time of people like John Maynard Keynes and Sraffa, Nikki Kaldor, all of the great kind of male economists associated with Cambridge, and she very much challenged, I think, a lot of their thinking. She got quite interested in Marxist economics. She got very interested in the economies of India and China and travelled a bit with that. And she seemed a very strong and powerful figure, and so in a sense she became my influence once I got to Cambridge. Some might say a more positive influence than Margaret Thatcher, I don't know.
So I guess in terms of economics, like, for instance, in research, you will often see in papers that, like, you come to all these conclusions but the data was only using men. And you see that a lot, even just during your degree when you're reading research for your essay or
That's true.
such. I think there is right now maybe a small revolution of such going on in the research, like an active encouragement to improve the data that's used and like consider other aspects of the economy, like home life and family life when you're doing research. And then what I was saying about it getting worse was based on student numbers. I remember like reading on the BBC that shows that unlike computer science or maths and other STEM subjects, which are seeing female participation gradually increasing, economics in the UK is actually seeing falling numbers. Like, to me, that was quite surprising because I guess I just had the view that all subjects were becoming more balanced.
That women were making progress in all areas. It is interesting that. So there are around 3 times as many young men studying economics in the UK as there are young women. And as you say, that has stagnated and, if anything, dipped compared with where we were 10 years ago or so. It's interesting, you talk about how a lot of the data that we use as economists is very much based on men's lives, so men's experiences in the labour market. If we're looking at inequality and social mobility, we look at men and how they have progressed in life compared with their fathers, because often that's what we have easiest data on. You know, particularly if you're looking across time, women's occupations were not always recorded on things like marriage certificates or birth certificates and things like that in the way that men and fathers were, and so on. So I think that definitely is an issue. And then you also talked about how the family, community, society is something that economists are having to better grapple with and try and integrate into their models. And I think here it's interesting to reflect on when modern economics was born, and actually it was born in the late 19th century. And that was a time when women had actually moved backwards in terms of their involvement in the formal economy. So we'd had the Industrial Revolution, and what's really interesting is during that Industrial Revolution, which was of course the beginning of sustained modern growth in Britain, but during that Industrial Revolution, women's involvement in the labour market fell rather than rose. The proportion of women working fell from about 65% to 45%, according to figures from my colleagues. And so economics then starts to form at a time when we increasingly see men's role as being to earn money in the labour market, and women are increasingly feeling pushed into the home, into those reproductive and caring responsibilities, unpaid responsibilities. So then we have this wall that goes up, in a sense, between what we see as economics, which is basically what men are doing out there, paid work in the market or in politics, versus what women are doing. And we start to see that more social, reproductive, unpaid caring side of things as somehow quite separate. So I think ever since modern economics was born in the late 19th century, we've had quite a rigid way of thinking about what is the economy. And if we think about economist models, if we think about people in those models, what we call labour, if we think about a production function, output in the economy is a function of machines and labour and technology as well, but we see their labour, people, as an input into the production process, as if we all just appear from nowhere, at working age, ready to engage and are able to engage and produce in this economy, when of course what we know is that people, labour, often from a woman's point of view, very much an output themselves of many, many years of reproductive and caring labour. And so there is this mismatch, in a sense, between the real world of economic activity, which involves a lot of that reproductive and caring labour, and what economists take from that real world and model. And I think until we have, as economists, a more holistic model of the economy, then it's not surprising that we have things like the crisis of care that we have right now in the economy. For the last 50 years or so, it's been very much a policy to try and encourage women into the world of work, but neglecting the fact that they were already doing work. It was just unpaid work within the home, and that as you pull women into the labour market, that leaves gaps in terms of care that need to be filled. And because economists have for a long time neglected that, it's not surprising, therefore, that gap in care that is left has gone unaddressed. And we're in the kind of situation that we have right now, where people on the ground are struggling to juggle childcare, elderly care, looking after elderly parents, as well as paid work at a time when wages are stagnating, when housing costs are increasing. The academic community that I have here in college is very special, and actually very different to what I have in economics, because economics does have quite a hostile environment towards female academics. And actually, we have had our Me Too moment back in the summer of 2017. In fact, it was an undergraduate who'd done her dissertation at an American university on, there's an online forum in economics called Economic Job Market Rumours. And what she did was to study the types of language used on that online forum in regard to female economists versus male economists. And so she found, by scraping that forum, that when people in economics are talking about female economists, they'll use words like hot and attractive and breasts. When they're talking about male economists, they'll use words like intelligent and books. So there is this quite apparent problem in economics, and that really spurred a whole series of papers and revelations in economics. I mean, we have the horror that is in the US recruitment of academic economists, it was very common to be interviewed in a hotel bedroom where you are sat on a bed with academics on chairs in front of you being interviewed for your post. And this happened at the American Economic Association annual meeting. This was part of the normal thing. And actually one of my former Cambridge students, she was at St John's, not a Kean. She got a scholarship to go to do graduate studies in the US, and now is an early career researcher in the US, and she has led the fight to change that way in which interviews take place in the US job market. Anna Stansbury, she's called a rising star in economics over in the US. So there is this quite hostile environment, I think, quite toxic environment towards women in the economic sphere. But the great thing about being part of a college like Key's is you are not surrounded by other economists. You are surrounded by people in so many different subjects. So I have colleagues here that are doing geography or that are doing research in science that hopes to resolve cancer. So from across so many disciplines. And actually I find that they are extremely open-minded and welcoming, and perhaps have a much better idea about what's happening in the economy than some of my economics colleagues do. And so it's really interesting to share ideas in economics with these people from different subjects, and they provide a really great support network. And of course, I can draw on the research and the work that they're doing and integrate it into my thinking about the economy. So I think there is something really, really special about the intellectual community here. And I think perhaps from the outside, it might look quite a traditional group of academics, but actually behind the beards and the faces and everything is a really forward-thinking, quite open-minded community. Of course, there can be exceptions, but I think we're a much more open-minded community than perhaps the image of us might be, and I really do treasure that, and I really do feel it's an honour actually to be a part of that community. And I think that's what keeps me going actually through the difficulties that you can face as a woman in economics. I think that having that support network of the college really does, in a sense, give you the support and the confidence to keep on going. So 5 years ago, I began an initiative, Women in Economics Day, an annual day, which is something we run for young women aged between 16 and 18 to come to Cambridge and hear from women in economics about the opportunities in the subject and the kind of gaps we need to fill. And I do think actually it's had a positive effect in terms of boosting the number of female applicants that we've had and so on. So Samantha, you are one of our brilliant young women in economics, doing amazingly well in your exams, first-class results across the board and so on. So do you see yourself as someone who could bring about change, as someone who can fly the flag for women in economics and make economics a subject that can deliver a better understanding of the world?
Yes. I guess there's like two aspects to it. From the... I don't want to say the establishment, that's not what I mean, but like the established academics that we already have here, challenging them and making sure that they look at the wider context too. Yeah. But then there's also the incoming future students.
Yes.
And I try to get involved in that too by helping out at the Women in Economics Days.
2 years on the run you've spoken at our Women in Economics Day.
As in fast forward 20 years, I definitely want to have done something meaningful in terms of not necessarily be the Prime Minister or something, but like, I guess what's important to me is not just going through life.
Standard channels of job in finance.
Yeah, I want to make sure that I do try to leave my own footprint and make an impact. Whether that's through politics or economics, I can't be sure, maybe both, I don't know.
Yeah, and it's interesting, we haven't yet had a female Chancellor of the Exchequer, have we? So there is a gap to fill.
Thank you to Samantha Onyekwere and Victoria Bateman. In the next episode of For the Love of Learning, we'll meet two Keans putting women centre stage, Keys Women in the Arts. Last year, the college held a garden party, part of their celebrations of 40 years of women at Keys, and some of the women who attended shared their memories of their time at the college with us.
For me, it was all about the academic side of it. So I wanted to study in the best place I possibly could. And then coming into such a beautiful space that felt so welcoming. Coming from a northern state school, I wasn't expecting it to be quite as inclusive as it is. I'm Francesca Hunt, I'm studying English at Gonville and Keys, and I'm the Women and Non-Binary Officer on the GCSU. Something I always think about the anniversary of Women at Keys is that it's fantastic to have had 40 years, and certainly within the student body it feels like we've always been here and there's no issue. Hopefully we'll carry on the success.